Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
All right, River, welcome to the show. And you and I know each other for a while now in different capacities, so it's really cool to have you here to tell your personal story. And you're also a psychotherapist, but I certainly welcome your professional perspective, even on your personal life, like what you know now. I think it'll be really cool to dive into that as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that connection. There's a lot of therapists that have lived through some trauma, and that's part of why they chose that career. So yeah, that's certainly the case for me as well.
Amazing. Okay, cool. So let's start at the beginning. What's your religious denomination? Where were you raised?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small Ontario city, Kitchener. And so my denomination was called Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada. And so my dad was a pastor. And so this is kind of like the popular denominations are like Baptist and Pentecostal, kind of somewhere in between those two things. And so some pretty strict views, especially growing up as in the pastor's family. I think it is different for me than it was for like peers that were in the same denomination. But yeah, that's kind of where that lands.
Yeah. What would you describe? I'm still slowly piecing together my knowledge of all these different Christian denominations. What would you say were like the main tenets of specifically this Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada?
So like mission, so doing like evangelical work, where trying to like spread the gospel was like a core tenet. So I remember sending missionaries to Africa and Central America and things like that. And they would come and they would present and then ask for offerings and things like that. So that was a core tenet of our beliefs. And then this triune God. So you've got the God, Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And so that was also a core tenet of our beliefs, where different religions didn't necessarily believe in that. And like the three are equal and separate. So that was a core belief. And we kind of differed in different, like comparatively to other denominations. So we were allowed to have like different types of music, where other churches at the time were only doing like piano and guitar. And so I remember what the church that I grew up in from birth to about grade, that's all we had. We had piano, guitar, maybe a couple guitars and a couple of singers. And then the new church that I went to, which is the same denomination, but we moved cities. And that church had like a drum kit, an electric guitar, and a bass guitar, like full band kind of thing. And so our denomination had that full spectrum. So that was like allowed. I remember things like dancing and drinking were not completely outlawed, but they were for my family. Like we had to like kind of be held to like a different standard than the rest of the church. But within our denomination, like those things were allowed. And on the flip side, some things like, my denomination didn't support a woman's right to choose what to do with their body. And so abortion was a huge issue. I remember a woman in our church growing up that was arrested on Parliament Hill for protesting abortion rights. And she was celebrated when she came home because of that. And, like kind of gave her this like martyrdom attitude. And yeah, so that's kind of where we fall.
Yeah, that paints a bit of a picture there. And so I can go into so many different directions already, but I'm curious. The first question that jumps into my mind is how many siblings you had.
Mm-hmm. I had 3. So all older. I had 2 older brothers and an older sister.
Okay, so you're the youngest.
I am.
Okay. And what was your parents' relationship with religion?
It was literally everything. So we prayed before every single meal. I remember we had this like little glass container that sat in our kitchen, and it had like a prayer and a prompt for like a year or so. We would read one of those things and reflect on our religiosity and our relationship to Jesus Christ and God, just like a part of every day. I was in, like, if I wasn't going to bed and praying before I went to sleep, I would have felt wrong for doing that. I felt like a lot of guilt if I wasn't doing things like that. And then as I grew older, it was things like daily devotions. So like that's, and now I kind of have a practice of like meditation and journaling, which is really, really similar, but this was just like focused on, prompts from the Bible
Right.
and journals from here or there and things like that. It affected every aspect of my life. We were centered around God. We were centered around the church activities. So my dad, the church was right across the street from my house. We just like had to walk over. Growing up, the church owned the house, so we lived in a parsonage, and my dad was there all the time still, even though he could have been home. And then he would come home for dinner, and like 3 or 4 nights of the week, there would be events at the church that he would have to go to. And same thing for my mom, running like we called it Thunder Club, just like a kids club, a couple nights a week. And so she was doing different grades and things like that. So often out of the house at the church for different events. And then that doesn't include things that happen once a year, like Vacation Bible School or the church Christmas pageant. And so all of those things were happening. And I remember being in choir as a 10-year-old kid. So yeah, every aspect of my life revolved around the church and the church's activities.
Yeah. So parents super involved in the day to day. Maybe they're not even around so much because they're so busy with that.
Yeah.
And then you're just as much as you can as a kid, sort of getting looped into everything you can and having to be like the star child, if you will, the poster child.
Yeah. And definitely not the star child within my family. I was definitely the black sheep of my specific family. But when you grow up in the environment that you grow up, you don't think that anything is different. You just think that this is normal and things like that. So I remember my dad saying like, we're the example. You got to do this. You got to church potlucks. Like you have to go last. We're serving our greater church community and things like that. And so I just thought this was normal. I was like, oh, okay, this is, and I fully bought in. I remember, so for a lot of people, like the moment that they accept Christ is like a transitional moment, and like they'll remember this. That happened for me when I was in grade 1. So I was likely 6 years old. I remember that exact moment, which is way too young for a kid to kind of make that decision. I had no idea what I was accepting into my life and what I was making a commitment to in terms of religion, but it just like, I didn't feel like I had any other option. I just felt like this was the life that I was born into, and you kind of have to roll with it. You have to do everything that your parents tell you to do, especially because my dad especially was telling me like, this is how you get belonging in our family, is that you've got to do this. And I remember my mom, like once I was a teenager, having a conversation with her about being a pastor's wife and about how that's a choice. You marry a pastor, you're taking on a role yourself. And it's not like, you're married to an architect, because there's nothing that comes along with being married to an architect. There's a lot that comes along with being married to a pastor, and especially my dad specifically. So that impacted everything.
Yeah. Was she on board the same way? Like she was gung-ho with your dad equally?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
They were unified in that, and they felt like they were, it really felt so like this Bible verse that I'm separated from my wife now that I got married within this denomination. And so this Bible verse that a man shall leave his mother and father and find his wife, and the two shall become one. So this is something that I've had to deconstruct, but that really was the example that my parents set. So they would say like we instead of I quite often. And, when we moved churches, they would say like, we are called to this church. We are called to go like deliver God's message in this community. And that was definitely a fused relationship. So they were both, they were both on board. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. My parents were the same way. And there was these celebrated stories of this famous rabbi, and he went to the doctor with his wife and her foot was hurt. And he would say, "Doctor, our foot hurts." And my father would ironically parody that. So he would jokingly refer to anything that was going on with my mother as our. There was this kind of duality of like, I'm not at that level, but I want to be. That is the ideal. So he would play around with that. He wasn't as, I guess, overtly sincere.
Right.
But nonetheless, that was there. The constant same front, everything that they make decisions are always unified, right? There can be no difference of opinion with the mom thinks one thing and the dad doesn't. There's no way to balance that. What's your take on that? Like, what is going on there on a psychological level?
I think that's reminiscent of a patriarchal culture, particularly in most religions around the world, where they've identified man as head of the household or things like that. And it's a woman's job to support or defer decision making and things like that to the man. And this is not just in religious places, this is around the world in many ways. I felt this as well in my marriage. I remember telling my former wife, I forget that we're different people sometimes. I forget that you have your own thoughts and things like that. And that's just a microcosm of that effect where you really merge your own identity with someone else so that you create this identity of a couple. And that's really, really harmful for people. And so as a psychotherapist, I do relationship counseling and I support couples in my work to think about what you want for yourself and not what you want for the group, because those things are often different. And people, like, it's a revolutionary idea for people to think about, like, wait, I get to think about, like, I want to go fishing just like by myself, and I get to do that. This is a revolutionary thought for a lot of people, particularly, the older people are, the more that this is just like ingrained in them. And it just is wild to them for them to consider that they can have a desire or, chase something that's outside of what the couple wants or what's best for the family.
Yes, exactly. And I find that it transcends even just patriarchy. This story that I was telling is actually told as like celebration of how devoted the man was to the woman, but it's still harmful nonetheless because it is an enmeshment in the world, in the psychological thing. It's like there's no sense of separate identity, as you were saying. And so you just become this one cohesive unit and you lose yourself in that, regardless of which is losing in the other. And everyone's just falling into this collective. And, certain cultures maybe celebrate collectivism more, and we're pretty solo oriented in the West. But nonetheless, I think there is a lot of value to at least parts of that. And I've noticed that, people are really getting lost. I'm curious, you mentioned being the black sheep at the end of the day. And I don't know what age did that start like showing up, and what did that look like?
I kind of always felt that, to be honest with you. I don't think there was a time where I didn't feel different. And so I think part of this extends beyond my family. So I was bullied in elementary school and things like that. But I always wanted different things. I remember growing up and wanting to wear my sister's clothes, for instance, and things like that. And constantly my family or people in the public were like calling me a girl and saying I was a girl, and I was assigned male at birth. I'm non-binary now. And that, like, part of that just like made me realize that I was just different, and particularly at school. So I had like a great amount of difficulty making friends at school. So I was just kind of like ostracized for everything that was different about me and within my own family. So as I became a teenager and things like that, like I would wear my hair long, or I'd wear different clothes that weren't just like the kind of the standard, like, white boy, frat boy clothes. And that just didn't fit with my family. That's not what they liked. I would listen to punk and I wanted to dye my hair blue and things like that. And it just didn't fit. And I found myself almost like there was this thing where I would be like ostracized for these things, but then that would also motivate me to keep on going to be different. And like it became an intentional thing where I like, maybe it became a self-fulfilling prophecy for me, but I wanted to be separated from my family. I didn't really realize it at the time, but it makes more sense to me now. And actually kind of this is just hitting me as a light bulb moment for right now, is that I never really felt like identified with the things that they believed in, but despite believing it. And I believed it for probably like really, really devoutly for at least my first 21 years. And I don't think I lost my faith until I was around 24, 25, and then progression from there. But yeah, in my family, anything that made you different, we would like make fun of you for it. So I had really large feet. I have size 15 feet and bigger than everyone else in my family. So that would be something that my brothers and my dad would point out all the time, say like, oh yeah, look at these boats on your feet, or like, you're going to go water skiing, like things like that. And it was just like, there was always things like that. That's just how my family operated. If I was different, which I was a lot, that was focused on, and that became a point of emphasis. We're going to highlight this part where you don't quite fit into the box. And then I was just like, fuck the box from there. Yeah, just didn't want anything to do with it.
That's fair. I'd love to discuss this more. So, for example, from what I was originally hearing from you, that being different, a lot of it was not rebelliousness per se. It was, I am just different at some point, but I didn't really hear from you anything about like, oh, I needed to show them. I need to stick it to the man. It doesn't sound like there was about that.
Yeah, it wasn't about that until at this point in my life. And now I feel like there are things about myself that I feel like I'm motivated to express them in like an authentic way. And I realize that these things may be an affront to my dad in particular, but this whole community, because it's not just my dad. My dad comes from his own Christian family. So it is like my 28 first cousins are, most of them are devout Christian, not all of them, but yeah, it's my entire family on this big spectrum. So yeah, it definitely wasn't like I'm going to stick it to the man. I did go through the grungy teenager phase where I was really into the punk music scene. And so that stick it to the man was just the anthem, like that was the rallying cry of punk at the time. And so that became an identity that I latched onto. But in that sense, it wasn't even because I was still very Christian at the time and in the punk music scene. So my stick it to the man was like, stick it to the corporation, stick it to the governments, things like that. Be different in those ways. But I was still very devout and still trying very hard to be like the best Christian person that I could be.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile that deep devotion, which you came online even like first grade, with that sort of realization even now, as we're talking even of not being identified with the values completely? How do those two coalesce together in that period of time?
Sorry, how did those two exist at the same time then?
Yeah, right. Because like you're going through. Obviously now you're not there anymore, but back then you're saying that even then part of you realize now that part of you already then was not identified with those values the same way,
Mhm.
and yet you would also deeply bought in to those values
Right. Yeah.
from first grade on.
And so it wasn't something that was conscious to me at the time. This was only something in the last, like, since I started my deconstruction journey, which has been probably about 10 years now or so. That's only something that I've learned in reflection. And so I could remember, like, literally I had this like memory of being in church and like worship music happening and me like daydreaming about being in like a VW van with the hippies and having free love and things like that. That's like what I wanted for myself. And at the time, like how I kind of reconciled that at the time, I just thought that you were born. And so I thought I was born and I thought I was like this lucky one. I thought that, I was born into a pastor's family. I got God like right away. I didn't have to struggle to get this. And I remember being jealous of people like standing up because giving your own testimony was really common in our church. So if someone was like addicted to drugs or in jail or something and they found God, we would like invite them to come speak in a service and tell their story. And so I remember hearing stories like that and like wanting something bad to have happened to me. Like, oh, I wanted God to save me from something like so badly. It's like I wanted to be able to tell a story. And I think that part of that is just like some of that is just like I wanted some attention. I wanted someone to like be able for me to share something and someone would be like, oh, that's cool. Like, way to go. Because people would share these stories and then like 50 people and come and give them hugs after the service and like they get money and stuff like that. It's just like, oh, like we are so glad you're here with us now. Like, this is so wonderful. Yeah. So it's definitely not something that I realized at the time that I didn't align with the values. I like had all this tension. I was like depressed. The first time I was suicidal, or I can remember being suicidal, I was like 8 or 10 years old. And so I didn't realize that all of this tension was coming from like living in a way that was not aligned with what I actually believe.
Yeah. And the way I've heard it phrased sometimes is like the part of you that needs belonging. And I think you said so outright before, right? This is how you become part of the family. This is how you're part of the community. It's such a great and basic need that you'll compromise on so many other things to maintain that. And so you're going to really deeply buy in because who wants to go to hell? Who wants to not go to heaven? So that's the part that is overt and over there. And then you get these other layers of a part that is like, but this isn't working for me at all. Right. And it's like an inherent contradiction. And you're way too young oftentimes to acknowledge said contradiction. You reminded me, I talk a lot about being in first grade and reading the Bible because we did endless Bible reading. And just like, what are these two sentences, these two verses? They're back to back and they don't make any sense. Each of them is a non sequitur. And I'm 6 years old. I do not know what a non sequitur is. I just know that the language here is completely wrong. Later on, Bible critics, they believe each of those is a separate author. So at 6 years old, I'm onto the fact that there's different authors in the Bible. I have no clue. I'm like, what's going on? And I don't have the words to even ask it. And to me, that's always like a metaphor of this sort of sense where like you're bought in, you're reading it with the utmost devotion, but like what is going on, like part of you just doesn't get it. There's a bewilderment of children. It's a special kind of bewilderment that you can have towards an entire idea or towards the entire framework. So that's kind of what it brings up for me. You're not the first person, and I can think of extensive amounts of this in my family where people like the whole making fun of you for stuff that you have. Like it's one thing if you're trying to enforce I don't know, right? Like why are you wearing long hair? You should just cut your hair and conform. But other things are like body stuff, right? It's like literally who you are. And that behavior, which almost anybody would say is unbecoming of a Christian or a pastor or something like that. And I have seen similar things in my family. What is going on there for that kind of person who is able to be a pastor and lead a church and make you stay behind at the buffet table or whatever it was, but then like make fun of you like that? What is the mechanism? Curious if you have a take.
Yeah, so that is a huge thing for me because I would sit in church and listen to my dad preach God's love to everybody, and him coming home and being so stressed out of holding space for everybody's needs in our church, not focusing on his own at all because he was serving God. He was just stressed out at home all the time, like all the time. And so my like most consistent memory of my dad is him being angry at me and like yelling at me. And so things like corporal punishment. So like I got like bar soap in the mouth and I got spanked and I got wooden spoons on my hands and I got yelled at and then sent to my room to like manage my feelings alone. And this is all coming from like, not all from my dad. My mom disciplined me as well, but it was primarily my dad. So like to hear him preach this like really rosy, romantic, like God loves you and you're safe here and compassion and all these different things. And for him to come home and be like this source of chronic abuse for me. And I think like abuse might be a sensitive word for people, but this is exactly what it is. Like you think of any like 7-year-old kid and you think about going to smack them in the ass or like shoving soap down their mouth. Like there's no other definition for that other than abuse. But I also recognize at the time that was parenting 101. That's what everyone was encouraged to do. And this is why we have a mental health epidemic. I was talking with my partner this week about my attachment style romantically, and I have this disorganized attachment style. Of course I have a disorganized attachment style, having a father like this that would, show love and preach love and things like that, and then come home and show me these actions, which for me on a visceral level doesn't communicate love. I'm not feeling loved by this discipline and things like that. And so, everyone's an enigma. So for my dad, if you wanted to figure out why this is happening for him, we'd have to like sit him down and put him through several years of therapy for him to realize why that happened for him. The science would show the likelihood is that his own needs were not met and he didn't know how to get them met in an adaptive way. And I think that's what commonly happens. You can't have parents going to meet their kids' needs when their own needs aren't met. And so that's just what it is.
Yeah, I think that's succinct and profound. I look at my father, the cult that I was raised in, they were a personal growth cult within religion, and it was all about happiness. Like, this is the gateway to happiness and meaning, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I look at him and I was like, you're not happy. And he's like, I am happy. I was like, none of the things you're doing is what happy people do, And so it becomes an argument of defining happiness. And according to my definition, I look at him, you're not happy. So none of this is working. So it's the story that you're telling yourself. And then everything you live around it is this peace, love, and joy thing that you're supposed to be propagating. And so far from reality, it's like, what is this thing that I've been sold? I mean, that's my journey of leaving. It's a separate story. But it comes down to that point here was probably how I would describe, in a way, why I actually end up leaving, the inherent contradictions. But back to you, I'm curious, is there anything else that you would, you know what, I'm pretty sure there is. I would ask you what in particular of these many, many things that were clearly not aligned with who you were, was there anything in particular that fucked you up within the context of religion?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me, and I think the big thing for a lot of people in Christian religion, is original sin. That's just like you're born and you're not worthy just because you were born. And that's just so like such the opposite of what I tell clients with step into my therapy room, is that, you're valid. Just you showed up today, you're valid. Doesn't matter what's going on. Like if you're, you didn't do any of the things that you said you would do from the last session, you're still valid. This inherent guilt, this inherent shame for just being a human has infiltrated every single aspect of my life. And despite me deconstructing for the last decade, this still shows up all the time. It shows up during sex. It shows up, like just in regular conflict with my partner. I feel guilty. I feel responsible. I feel like this horrible person just because I made like simple mistakes that everybody makes. And so, yeah, this in my religion, like the wages of sin is death. And so when you're born into sin and you don't get a shot, it's like you deserve to die just because you were born. Like this is like that is just so impactful. I think until like we're brainwashing children into this belief. I was 6 years old when I accepted this. When I accepted I'm a horrible person at 6 years old. Like how fucked up is that, And so obviously you can draw the connection to this. I can think different ways and I can tell you that I've deconstructed this and this belief, but there's this visceral core part of me that may never stop believing this about myself. And this may be something I always have to face and struggle with and get support from and challenge this deeply seated belief that is like a neural pathway that I may never deconstruct.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it matches Judaism. Some would say that they borrowed it from the Christians. Some would say they have it on their own, a similar existential level of unworthiness. As you were talking, I was like, theologically, why the hell would you bring sinners into the world, right? Why is there a commandment to make more babies if everybody is just a sinner? Like seemingly you're propagating evil unless otherwise noted. And like that's where my mind goes. But right. There's many holes we can poke in the theological concept.
Well, I want to stick with that because in my religion, that question gets asked. And the answer for that is for the glory of God. I'm like, so this omnipresent, all-knowing being that is supposed to be like altruistic and things like that is just like this selfish asshole, really. Yeah, when you
like create wounded whales, create turtles with like plastic things on their fins so that God can show up and cut the thing off and be like, look at me, right? That's like the arc.
I'm not going to fix it myself. I'm going to send my son, my like favorite thing that is like more a part of me than the rest of you. And I'm going to get them to be perfect just to show you how terrible you are. And they're going to die, even though they don't deserve to die, but they're going to die in your place. So you have something even more to feel like shameful for.
Yeah. Right. Like, did Jesus work hard to get where he was? No, he was born the Son of God. So he's not even a comparison. You can't factor him in. Whatever he managed to pull off is irrelevant to us. And yet we still feel bad in his shadow. I'm assuming there's something like that going on. It's just mind blowing. I wrote a parody once of like, we don't have Jesus, but we have these rabbis. Rabbis are basically the second thing to God in Judaism. And so everyone reads these rabbi biographies and they're all like, he was amazing from birth. He was a genius at age 4 and shit like that. And it's like, great, I'm not a genius at age 4. Now what am I supposed to do? And I wrote a story and it said, this shows you just how great you could become if you were born a completely different person. So lots of fuckery occurring. And so if it makes sense, if there's anything you would add about what was going on for you at that time, I welcome that. And if not, we can kind of move forward towards that deconstruction phase, right? And you mentioned marriage, and I don't know if that happened before or after. So chronologically, what happens next?
Yeah, so I believe I was 16 or 17 when I met my wife. We lived about 2 hours apart. We were friends over MSN and we wrote snail mail letters and called each other on the actual telephone. That's how we formed our friendship. And then I think I was 17 or 18 when we started dating. And then I got married when I was 21 and she was 20. My dad married us. He did the ceremony. So my son was dedicated. We did it at a park. So like even like my small act of rebellion within the church was like, I'm going to dedicate my son, but in a park, not in a church. And that like kind of meant something, that I was doing it not in a church. And so that must have been like 25 or 26 years old. And then my first daughter was not dedicated. I had kind of lost the religion by that point, or had at least starting. It was not for me, it was not like a specific, like one day I was and one day I wasn't. It was a much more gradual, like, I'm not really sure about this thing. And yeah, I think it must have been around 30 when I was finally like lost all connection to that faith.
Okay, let's understand here. So you had 2 kids by the time you were 30?
Kids by the time I was 30.
3 kids by the time you were 30. Okay. And so the last 2 weren't dedicated.
That's right. Yeah.
And for my ignorance, what is dedication?
Yeah, that's essentially what it is without the baptism. So in my denomination, we baptized adults. We didn't baptize kids. And so if you wanted a child to like be raised in the church and in the community and things like that, then they would be dedicated. It's basically parents making a commitment to raising a child in the Christian way, if you will. And so my wife and I at the time, we wanted it to be a little bit different because we weren't actively involved in a church at that point. Like we were going to one, but it wasn't like consistent and we weren't like active participants in that church. And so we wanted it to be more of our like friends and family that were close, like come join us and like help us raise this child. Essentially, that's not what happened. They didn't, but that's what our goal was.
It was more of a social thing. It was a celebration.
Yeah, and my son's name is Atreyu, which means son of all, which was kind of intentional on our part. Like we had both recognized that it takes a village, and there was lots of people at that ceremony, and yeah, my like family members and things like that would like babysit and things like that. But I think Shalom, that it really is you're on your own.
For sure. Yeah, like nobody gets. The single people don't get. My siblings, most of them are not married. Most of them don't have kids. I'm with kids. Why would they want to really burden themselves with that? And I respect it. I mean, good for them.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, a bunch of little details. How you met your wife at the time? You met her 2 hours away. How did you guys meet? Was it a church related?
Yeah, we met at our church. So our denomination had 2 camps, like summer camps. And so we met at one of those summer camps.
Okay, very cool. And is she religious at this point, or was your journey out separate from hers?
We had very similar journeys. So she was not like the pastor's family, but in the same denomination. And so there's kind of like a little belt from like maybe London area or Kitchener all the way down to like St. Catherine's, where there's like lots of our churches. And so she grew up in a different church in Kitchener than the one that I grew up in, a much larger one. We had not met while we were kids at all. But yeah, we met at camp, which I have a really, like the way we met is like a fairy tale kind of story. So if a different podcast or a different time, I'll share that story with you.
Amazing. What was that journey like for you? What started happening?
So the catalyst, so about 5-6 weeks after my marriage, my mom died in a car accident. And so that completely shifted my whole world. And I just started asking questions at that point. For a religious person, blame God, or at least I did initially. I blamed God and said like, why me, why us, things like this and stuff like that. It just like, it felt really unfair. And going through the typical cycles of trauma and grief when that happened. And so a year after that, I moved from Ontario. Me and my wife moved to Manitoba so I could go to a Christian university out there to finish my studies and to play sports with my brother who was already going to that school. So they billed themselves as a liberal arts Christian university. And so I took sociology and anthropology there. And my sociology teachers were woke. And so they would fight for gay students' rights and things like that. And rural Manitoba, that was a huge deal. One of those professors was a middle-aged woman. And I'm not sure if she knows this, but essentially became my mentor and taught me things that I kind of wish my mom would have been there to teach me. And so that was like the impetus for me to like continue on deconstructing, because I started realizing that, well, first at that time, I started realizing there's Christians that don't actually believe in this whole like rigid sets of beliefs. They are like divergent thinkers within this. And so that's what I latched onto. So I started going that way because I had been like previous to that, I had been homophobic and things like that. And so that started deconstructing that belief. And then when I started being more accepting and less judgmental of like a more diverse set of Christian people, I just kept going. And like this paradigm doesn't fit with my values because it's still excluding people. And then it expanded a little bit more, and this paradigm doesn't fit because it's still excluding people. And then so on and so on. And so yeah, that my mom dying was like, if she hadn't have died, I'm not sure if I would have lost my faith at all. Obviously, I don't get to know that, and who knows like what life would be had that not happened. But that's when I really started questioning, and that's when I stopped going to church my dad stopped being a pastor as well. He went back to church. He went back to try. He medically could not. So he was also in the car accident that killed my mom. So he medically could not be a pastor immediately after. And then when he went back after, I think he lasted just a couple of months and then couldn't do it without her. He had remarried very, very quickly after. And his new wife, like wonderful, beautiful person, but just not equipped to be the support that my dad needed to be a pastor, because my dad really, really relied on my mom for that.
So as far as your story is concerned, that final straw was your mom dying. And so there's all that anger, and that allowed you, would you not have gone to that university because that was already a step out, or you would have gone and it would have been just completely closed off? Like
Yeah,
from any...
I had no intention on going to that university. So my mom died. My brother was already at that school. So my mom died in August. So he wasn't at school. He was like back home when she died, but he delayed going back to school that year for a few weeks just to manage himself and things like that. So my brother, myself, and one of our best friends, like mutual best friends, all similar ages, and we're all like heavily involved in sports. So my brother was on a hockey team out there, and it occurred to him at some point, like my mom's death got him thinking about life and like seizing the day and things like that. And he was like, we will never have an opportunity. We're not amazing athletes by any means, but he said to us, like, we will never have an opportunity to play something together at a high level. So like, come out here. We were both in university, me and my friend Steven, and he said, finish your degrees out here and we get to play 1 year together. And so that's what we did. And it was kind of like a no-brainer for me. I went to my wife, and I actually I was working a job at an insurance company, which wasn't paying very well and I wasn't really happy with. And I had made it all the way through the interview process at Toyota Motor Manufacturing, which would have been like $100K a year job. And I turned that down to go to school out in Manitoba. And I was like poor as shit. Like my wife and I were having to choose between like groceries and electricity a few months while we were living out there. And so, yeah, we gave all that up and absolutely would not have done that. It wasn't even on my radar at all had my mom not died.
Wow. So you're already working. You weren't really doing the university thing. What was the sport that you were playing?
So we played. I had gone to 1 year at Trent, and like that just didn't work out for me. And then I did another year of Christian college in Kitchener, a really small school, which actually my denomination school, the school that my dad had graduated from. Interestingly enough, my wife's parents had known my dad from like just crossing paths at that school like 20, 30 years earlier.
Okay, so it was really tight knit. So you'd already accumulated kind of haphazardly 2 years of university, transferred the credits, finished it the last year over in Manitoba. Yeah. Oh, cool. So was that like kind of the end of it? I'm curious, for example, and this isn't about your ex, but did she leave alongside you? Was there a period of time where there was a mismatch? And I guess another question is, did the marriage end up ending related to religion, or was it unrelated, which we don't need to go into?
Yeah, so the marriage ending was unrelated to religion. So yeah, it wasn't until years later that I had like fully like left religion. I remember the moment where I was like, oh yeah, I am completely done. Growing up, I told you that story about that protester that got arrested. I had grown up with that belief that abortion is murder, basically. And as I started deconstructing things, especially after going to school, I had changed my perspective. It shifted just slightly, whereas I respect a woman's right to choose, but what they're choosing is murder. And so like that's kind of where I had landed. And was working with somebody one time and we were talking about this, and he like very abruptly was like, like, how can you believe that? Like the person that you are and things like that. And I remember when he said that to me, I was like, oh yeah, I actually don't. I don't. And then that was the moment where I was like, it's all gone now. I don't believe any of it. Like this just shaped my beliefs into something that just doesn't align with me. And so that was the moment. My wife at the time, we kind of went on our deconstruction journey at a similar time, but it happened very differently. And I think because we had that fused, unified mind, that when I started losing it, she was kind of in the same place. And for very similar reasons that, this is not our denomination in general was very hypocritical, and that this doesn't allow acceptance and love to everyone. And that is something that a value that we both held. And so it was kind of a similar journey and similar timing. I really can't speak to hers. We did talk about how traumatic it is to hold these sets of beliefs and then not have them anymore. And that's traumatic because I was like living my whole life based on this value system, based on this belief system that I don't have anymore. So how do I live my life? And so like when you have that thought, when that thought becomes conscious, you're like, whoa, I've got to do some work here and like think about what I actually want to like live my life, how I actually want to live my life, and got to go create that meaning for yourself, which is very like, it's a lot of work and it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah. You said that really well. It's like it emphasizes the reasons to stay where you are,
Yeah.
because there is this huge leap out into nothingness, and you have to go through what I call the no man's land of personal growth, which is you've left your old way behind. You absolutely don't know where you're headed or what you are, and you've got to walk through this, like, it's just full of craters and barbed wire, and now you're just walking. And you're walking and you don't know, you know where you don't want to be and you don't know where you're going, and it's really destabilizing. And so I really resonate with that. And so kind of fast forwarding to today, and this is the part where I'd love for you to just describe, what was that like for you to walk away from it all, and where do we find you now? What has helped you heal? All of that.
Yeah. So it's certainly a challenge because my family still, like by and large, holds those beliefs. As a 35-year-old adult, I'm afraid to tell my dad what my beliefs are because I just know for him, he's got this belief that you should train up a child. And this is another Bible verse, train up a child in the way he should walk. And when he is old, he will not turn from it. I imagine for me to like show my dad who I am truly, he's got all this guilt and shame about being a failure as a dad because he's got this unrealistic goal that you can control a kid and things like that. And so, yeah, it's been really challenging to interact with my family, especially because when I now go meet them and I share where I'm at, they just don't understand, and I exist outside of what they find acceptable. And, you know, being a non-binary person, being a polyamorous person, being someone that kind of engages in activities that they pathologize and say like, this is only something that mentally ill people would do, or like people that like, you know, heathens would do. That's my life to them. So it is challenging to have those interactions. And I've taken the step to just not. So I have very minimal contact with my family now, and that's intentional, and that's for my own safety and for my own alignment, because my sister is a little bit different than my brothers and my dad, but they just don't know how to meet me. So that's where I'm at with that.
So, for example, that moment that you said that you left completely around that abortion discussion, how many years ago was that?
I would say 7 or 8.
Okay, so it's been a good few years now, and surely when you reflect back over that arc, there's probably quite an arc before and during that. And what was that arc like? Like, what would you say, you know, over the years you've finally managed to shift maybe? Like, you know, it was something that you're really working on. You know, you've mentioned some things that you probably still struggle with. What were things that you've been able to let go of over time?
So one of the biggest things is like my role as a father. You asked earlier what has been really helpful for me. New relationships for one, and within that umbrella of new relationships is the therapist that I've had. I've been going to therapy consistently myself for the last, and I remember the very first therapist that I saw, I was telling them like I should be this dad, and my wife and I were going through some relational trouble at that time, and I was talking to her about like, you know, I'm not going to, like, I don't want to be a dad. Like, I realized what I signed up for. Like, I have these kids, but I don't want to be a dad. I don't like this. Just, it didn't give me the feelings that I thought it would. And just like, that's another podcast. We can talk about parenting, but yeah. And she challenged me and like asked me like, who's telling you should do these things? Or these are the things that you should want. Is it okay for you to not want the things that you want? And yeah, that was really impactful for me to start thinking about like, oh, I get to choose. Like, regardless of what environment I've been in, I get to say what I want. And whether or not I get those things, it's a lifetime commitment, So yeah, I can still like honor that as being in alignment with myself, even though I like can't get that. And so that's been really supportive for me and really impactful in this journey. And like you talked about this arc, and I think like if you think of me at birth before I was indoctrinated with all these beliefs, I think that's like baseline. Like that's, and then my religiosity peaked probably at like 18 or 19 years old or something like that. And then I like got back down. I don't think I'll ever get back down to zero because I think there's still impacts there. But yeah, that seminal moment in that conversation with my friend where now I might not be at zero, but now I'm in control of the rest of my life, where I lay like the path forward on this graph. That's encouraging, like coming to that realization that I get to be the designer of my life. That's been really encouraging. And that allows me to let go of any old programming that comes up. I can now like programming comes up, the shame comes up or guilt comes up. I can just recognize it, say, okay, I get where you're coming from, but I'm still in control and I'm going to steer the ship. I'm not going to let these emotions steer the ship.
So there's like a part that comes online and it says, I am now, right, like you said, captain of my own ship, right? You begin to shape your destiny in a way where until now it's been shaped for you. I very similarly described myself at 27 when I left. That's when my life began. Anything before that was dictated to me. I was basically this autopilot reaction to everything that came before. I've made many mistakes from 27 onwards, but they're my mistakes. And I can say, oh, okay, I take ownership, and it feels good even to make mistakes at that point. Whereas until then, it felt like fucking God reaching up through your anus and using you as a puppet. Yeah, so...
Well, I got something to say on that. Like what you said, like God kind of puppeting you. I really love that. That reminds me of, so like the first time my wife and I were having like marital problems, we got couples therapy. We did like a whole bunch of stuff to try to help our relationship. One of these things that happened is we found this blog by this person who they were selling some book or something like that. And their part of their story was that God helped them like fix their marriage. And so like they did all these things and their marriage got fixed. And they were like, glory to God, God helped us and things like that. And I'm like, you just gave all the credit away, like you did these things. Like God's not here. He's not this, like he's not this like thing you breathed in and now he's controlling you, like he's not like he's not the secret sauce, and you're giving away ownership to the things that you did that made your relationship better. Like you connected with your partner or you changed your conflict management or whatever. Like those are the things that you did. And I understand like God as a force and people giving credit. I'm like not trying to discount the people that believe in those things, but in that situation, like they discredited everything that they brought to the table by giving all the glory to God. You like ignore the ownership that you can take for, like what you said, for even your mistakes, for your successes and for your failures. And I think that's really important for people to just take ownership, good or bad, take ownership for how you show up in the world and your actions. And that is also for me decided shift, where before I was just running on autopilot. I like wasn't even conscious of my decisions. And now I realize I've got myself to answer to for everything, good or bad.
What are some things, you've mentioned therapy several times. Has there been anything else that has been helpful for you in your healing journey?
Yeah, I think the relationships that I've had since that have formed outside of the church. So my partner now is great. I only have great things to say about her, and friendships that I have now that people that I've met that didn't know me before, I get to tell them I was a way different person. Who I was 15 years ago is just so different than the person that I am today. And this is kind of mind-blowing to people because I'm pretty honest. Like I was racist. I was homophobic, like actively, like I shamed gay people and, I said fag and gay, like in derogatory ways, like all the time. I grew up as a male and this was common practice. And I get to own all of this now. And despite it not feeling great, like I'm not proud of these things, but without the ownership, I don't think I would be able to change it. And so that's helpful. A lot of the things that I've read, so I've read a lot of books on Eastern religions, which is something that resonates more with kind of who I feel like I am and my understanding of the world. So reading books in general has been really helpful because now I've got a new value system, and it's one that I chose, not one that was fed to me. And so that has also been really helpful. And I think the other part of that is just like giving myself self-compassion. And I think that's a big part of the work that I do with people in therapy. But just like loving myself, like literally that means so much, and it's hard to do. It's hard to learn how to do, especially when you grow up in shame culture, which most of us are because we live in a shame culture, just like outside of religion. But that has been really, really important for me, just like accepting where I'm at and loving myself for where I'm at. And
Thank you. And so you've already mentioned some amazing, I think, for people to work on. Is there anything else you would want to share for somebody earlier on the journey? Maybe they're still in, they're considering it, or maybe they're on some sort of journey out, a deconstruction. Is there anything else that you would like to share to them? This might be the kind of thing that you would tell your younger self or somebody else on that path. And this could be anything from advice to resources to anything at all that comes up.
I think in terms of resources, everyone is different, and some resources help some people and some resources help other people. I can't assume to have one that would work, but the one suggestion I would make is don't do this alone. If you're on a deconstruction journey or on a journey in anything, find people that have already done this or that are doing it right now as well. Just don't do this alone. Like the being in real community, and I think community is a buzzword now, and lots of people like to think that they're in community, but I think it's mostly fake. I think being in real community where you get to just show up exactly where you're at and someone's not going to judge you for that, find those people and hold on to those people, and like don't do this alone. It's hard. Like there are like nights and days crying, calling in sick to work because of like mental capacity is not there. It's dysregulating, So yeah, I would say don't do it alone and just love yourself as much as you can.
Amazing. Thank you, River. And what I usually like to invite people at the end is to make things fair. If you have any questions for me, you don't have to.
I was not prepared to ask you questions, but I think we could do a whole nother podcast episode.
We definitely can. I actually have one on the show at some point. I had Aviva interviewed me.
Oh, right.
And so one of the episodes is me. So it's at the very end. It is included in the list of questions. But absolutely.
Do you want to take this opportunity? Like you just offered a chance to be very vulnerable. So I want to seize that. I would say
that chance is open, by the way. You can seize that at any time. You don't have to use the podcast.
Well, yeah, this is being recorded. So I want to see, hey, like, what is the one thing, like a moment or situation that you would change in your life if you could do it over again?
Yeah. But I would say that in the areas that I can, I actually relate a lot to what you were saying about reluctant parenting. I'm very open about my reluctant parenting. And so I was not ready to be a father at basically 22 and like a month. And it was the single biggest mistake that I've made as an adult at the very least, and it's shaped everything, right? Whereas everything else can be rectified and you go to therapy. You don't go to therapy to heal your relationship with that. But it was brought up when you were very upfront about your journey, and I've had to grapple for years with reluctant parenting. And the first one, like I knew after the first child that I was not ready and not wanting and not interested even. Like there's some people are natural parents and I wasn't, and I just found myself there. And my parents are the same. They also should not have been parents, and they had 9 kids. And so that was this disingenuous, we have kids because we're supposed to thing, or the love comes like, and I love my kids, but this sort of like, oh, this parent, I knew that I was not paternal as a teenager. And when you have a kid, some switch will come online and you will be a good parent. And I was like, fuck it, that switch has never switched, and there's a deep sense of devotion. I parented out of guilt and obligation for many years, had to work a lot in the guilt. There's a lot of fear of being like my parents. That's a huge underlying thing that affects your own ability to just be your own parent. You're like, I hope I'm not them, instead of just looking forward and your own values. There was no modeling, right? You don't have a parent to say, I want a parent like that. You're like literally inventing parenting from scratch. I don't trust books. I don't trust any experts. I'm like literally in a vacuum trying to conceive of what being a parent looks like. The second child was born. I already knew I didn't want to have a child. So I was like, fuck this. We went on birth control, but Orthodox Jews use really shitty birth control. Only the woman can use it. The doctor had religious agendas because a religious family doctor, and he prescribed birth control that was like shittier, but didn't impact fertility the same way because that was his order of priority. One got pregnant again. And I was like, fuck this, right? But no, abortions is absolutely not a thing. And so now I have 2 kids, and so it's just a concept. I've made a lot of peace with it over the years, but absolutely the most significant thing. It's the most going from zero to something that you can do. You're dragging humans into this existence. Philosophically, I'm also an antinatalist. So I don't believe in bringing people into the world. I think one of the things I've had to grapple beyond the personal obligation, financially, emotionally, stuck in one place. I wouldn't live in Hamilton, Ontario as my ideal choice of where to settle down. And this is where it is because I'm a parent. The concept that there's another 2 human beings in the world who are experiencing all the suffering that humans inevitably suffer, and it's my doing, that is a very big burden that I do not take lightly. And it's something that it is what it is. But as somebody who experiences the world extremely deeply and is bothered by just being alive, I'm trying to set them up for a better life. So they're overall happier at their age than I was at their age. It's dues of trauma, but nonetheless, the fact that they have that anytime even they stub their toe, it's me. If they hadn't been brought into this world, they wouldn't stub their toe right now. So their pain is my responsibility in some ways, how I experience it. In a way, I think it's a very mature way because I think my parents were incredibly reckless in how they shot children into the world. T-shirt gun at like a contest, And each of us, my siblings, were all brilliant and smart and different and sensitive. And each of us deserves to be an only child as far as how much energy we take. And I'm sure you can relate. I'm sure maybe some of your kids are like that. Maybe you're like that. And it's like, damn, we did not deserve to be crowded into like a fucking cattle car with like 8 other people, and then 2 parents. We did family therapy, an hour and a half with a family therapist to voice all our grievances in the most best way possible. Everyone's silent and everyone's waiting for you to speak. And each of us gets 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. And that just tells you everything you need to know about like these large families. I wrote a blog post. Like people are like, we have large families because we celebrate life. We love life so much. It's like, if you love life so much, if you really cared about the individual person, you would give them some breathing space. Thank you very much. Right. So now I'm on a little bit of a rant, but that's what that brought out for me.
I appreciate the rant. Yeah. Very, very similar relationship to parenting, I think, for me. Yeah. I won't go into it for time, but yeah, I think, we could talk about this at length because I'm very, very similar orientation towards my own kids and gone through like the shame and the guilt of like I'm responsible. Like I'll take ownership for the choice. Like I did this and I can't blame this on anybody else. And then grappling with the fact of like, I love my kids and I want them to know that I love them and that I don't think that they're mistakes. It's just that I made a mistake, which is really hard for people to hold, like to see that and believe that that's true. And so I'm grateful for the relationship that I have with my kids now for like going through this process and not ignoring it. Because if I ignored this or like relationship that I have to parenting, then they would pay the price. But now I get to own this and I've been able to design my relationship with them because I'm intentional about it. And I get to speak to these like the trials of being a parent with people like you and other people I'm connected to that have a very similar experience. And I can get that validation there and I don't have to put that on them.
Yeah, it is like the single most controversial thing that you can probably say, pretty much. And I have a lot of controversial opinions, but I remember my blog, I'm vocal about everything. I talk about it all and I share it. And the times where I've been most like DM'd, please delete this post, is some supposed people from the community. It's like, one day your kids will read this and they will be traumatized that their parents didn't want them. I was like, I know my parents didn't want me, okay? And they never admitted it once. I just know it, okay? Because I experienced it. My kids, they're welcome. They can read it all. Like, I am an open book. I'm honest at every step of the way of where I'm at and where I'm not. It's hard to be honest in front of another person, but for them to read it, by all means. I think if my parents had admitted to me, hey, you know what? We were over our heads. We didn't know this wasn't a good idea. Honestly, it would be extremely validating. Right? You can take this breath of fresh air. This conviction that you've held has now been confirmed. And there's something really nice about that. It sounds like, no, of course, you're all special. We all love you so much, blah, blah, blah. It's like, come on. Okay. Like, give me a break. Give me a break. Like you weren't there. You didn't care. You weren't listening. And yeah, everyone's doing their best. I like there's a part of me that can hold all of that, and it's very hard to hold both. But
Yeah.
it's funny, like this interventions from the community suddenly so worried about mental health and
Mm,
people's well-adjusted childhoods.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Like
Yeah.
I'm literally a product of everything. Like my twitching is a product of your amazing system. So
Great.
if you don't mind, I'm gonna invent my own here.
Yeah, love that. Yeah. Talking, like being honest, like being able to tell your kids. This reminds me this past weekend. So like my son punched my daughter or something like that, and I reacted in a protective way, and I chastised my son. And then, an hour or so later, I went to him and I was like, I think I was like a little bit more angry with you than you deserved. And I was like, dude, this sucks to be you because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm literally just figuring this out, and you're my firstborn. And so you've had to pay for a lot of my mistakes of me just like learning how to be the parent that I want to be. And you've paid for that. And that's not fair to you. And he's 12 and he might not understand all of the implications of that. But I'm just like hopeful that like being honest about this, like I just like planting this seed, and like maybe to his little nervous system, this is validating to say like, yeah, I didn't deserve to feel unsafe when my dad was yelling at me, So I'm hopeful. Again, we're just figuring it out.
Yeah, I remember, again, this last week, I don't apologize. It comes very difficult for me. I woke up way too early to take my eldest to something, and they were so happy to be there, the first one in the school. And I was like, why am I up early to take you the first person to school? So I completely shat on their parade. And then I realized, okay, I got this whole story. I'm really cranky. It's been a lot. And I did apologize then like 2 hours later in the family setting too, which was like in public. And I'm proud of that. Like I don't think I got a single fucking apology in the entire time that I was there. Was it perfect? No, but it was a start, and it's nice to celebrate. I think, especially in the patriarchal society where we live, for us to be, and I know you identify as non-binary, but the pressures were on you at that time as well. And for us to be carving our own path that is based on common sense, honestly, and emotional intelligence, it's great. Hopefully this breaks the chain, as they say.
Yeah. We're doing
amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was happy to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.